The photograph arrived at the restoration lab sealed inside a brittle wooden box, its hinges eaten by rust and its velvet lining faded to the color of dried blood. It was catalogued as an 1847 daguerreotype of an unnamed couple, discovered during the demolition of an abandoned estate on the outskirts of Maine. At first glance, it appeared ordinary, just a stiffly posed man and woman staring into the camera, their expressions unreadable in the cold silvered plate. But something about it was wrong. The image felt heavier than it should, as if the moment it captured had been bruised by time, not simply preserved by it. When Dr. Elara Quinn, the lead restoration expert, examined the plate under magnification, she noticed faint distortions in the background. At first she assumed it was corrosion. But the more she cleaned, the clearer the shapes became, darkened smudges behind the couple, like elongated silhouettes standing too close, far too close, for any photographer of that era to have missed them. Curious, the team decided to enlarge the image using digital enhancement. As the screen sharpened and the shadows resolved into forms, the room grew deathly silent. The figures were not standing behind the couple. They were leaning over them. And their faces, if they could be called faces at all, were fixed directly at the camera, as though they had been waiting nearly 2 centuries for someone to finally see them. When the system finished processing, Dr. Quinn stepped back, trembling. The shapes were clearer than any of them expected. Too clear. And then the lights flickered. Something in the photograph had changed. The discovery of the 1847 daguerreotype began as a routine archival recovery, the kind that historians and restoration experts attend to without expecting anything extraordinary. A demolition crew had been tasked with clearing an abandoned estate on the outskirts of Maine, a long-forgotten property rumored to have been uninhabited for nearly a century. Most of what they found was predictable: rotted furniture, water-damaged books, broken mirrors, but then, wedged behind a collapsed fireplace, they uncovered a small wooden box. Its hinges were rusted nearly shut, and its velvet lining, once a rich burgundy, had faded into a dull, unsettling shade that looked almost organic. Inside was the daguerreotype, perfectly preserved despite the decay surrounding it, as if it had been waiting for someone to lift it back into the light. The image showed a couple seated stiffly side by side, their clothing appropriate for the mid-19th century, their expressions blank in the way early photographic subjects often were, but there was something about their posture that immediately caught attention. Their bodies faced forward, yet their eyes seemed misaligned, not quite meeting the camera, almost as if they were listening to something behind them at the moment the exposure was made. The photographer's mark was absent, an unusual detail for that era, which added to the mystery. When the box and its contents were delivered to Dr. Elara Quinn's restoration lab, the team initially treated it as a rare but straightforward historical artifact. However, the physical condition of the photograph raised subtle questions. The silvered plate felt colder than expected, unnaturally so, and the surface carried strange, darkened shapes that appeared neither as scratches nor typical oxidation patterns. These shadows pooled behind the couple like stains that did not belong to age or mishandling. Even before any enhancement was attempted, the expert sensed that the photograph held something beyond a simple portrait. The background seemed to warp the longer they stared at it, the shadows appearing to stretch toward the edges of the frame. The box itself provided no answers. There were no diaries, no documents, no family identifiers, nothing to explain who the couple was or why their image had been sealed away so carefully. The demolition crew insisted the house had been empty for decades, yet the daguerreotype felt preserved by intention rather than accident. For Dr. Quinn, the lack of context was far more disturbing than any physical imperfection. It implied that the photograph was meant to be hidden, not archived or displayed, and that whoever placed it in the box wanted it kept out of sight. When Dr. Elara Quinn and her team began the restoration process, their initial goal was simple: clean the surface, stabilize the silver plate, and digitally record the image for archival use. But the moment the plate was placed under the laboratory lights, the atmosphere shifted in a way none of them could easily explain. The shadows on the daguerreotype reacted strangely to illumination, not dispersing or flattening as ordinary shadows should, but seeming to deepen, as though the light only encouraged them to retreat into darker, more concentrated pockets along the edges of the frame. Dr. Quinn brushed it off as an optical illusion caused by the tarnish, though her voice carried an uncharacteristic uncertainty. The first step in the cleaning process involved gently removing surface debris with a dry, soft brush. Yet as the bristles swept over the plate, the dark markings did not shift, smear, or lighten. Instead, it looked as if they absorbed the motion, growing sharper in contrast while the rest of the image clarified around them. The couple's faces brightened slightly, revealing more detail in their clothing and the textures of their hair, but the mysterious shapes in the background remained stubbornly intact, resisting any attempt at removal. One technician joked nervously that the shadows looked fresh, a comment that earned him a sharp glance from Dr. Quinn, not because it was inappropriate, but because it echoed the exact thought she didn't want to voice. When the team switched to high-resolution scanning, the strangeness intensified. As the scanner's light bar traveled across the plate, the machine emitted a series of irregular beeps and pauses, almost as if the hardware were struggling to interpret what it was capturing. The digital image that emerged on the screen was clearer, more vibrant than the naked eye could perceive, and that was when the irregularities could no longer be dismissed. The shadows behind the couple had depth. Not artistic shading, not chemical corrosion, depth, dimension, the suggestion of forms partially hidden and yet unmistakably present. They resembled figures, but distorted in ways that made them neither fully human nor fully abstract, as though they were leaning into the frame from a place the camera was never meant to capture. The team exchanged uneasy glances, and even the hum of the equipment seemed louder in the heavy silence that followed. Dr. Quinn enlarged a specific area, expecting pixelation or loss of clarity, but the detail persisted, sharper than before. The shadows were not just shapes, they appeared to be positioned deliberately, almost possessively, around the couple, their posture wrong in a way that made the air in the room feel colder than it had moments earlier. As the team proceeded with the enlargement of the scanned image, the room settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the soft clicking of keys and the low hum of the computer processing the data. Dr. Quinn instructed the software to expand the background region first, concentrating on the darkest areas where the strange shapes clustered. Everyone expected that magnification would reveal ordinary imperfections, scratches, dust, or chemical deterioration typical of early photographic methods. But as the pixels sharpened and the grainy blur gradually gained definition, the technicians leaned forward, their expression shifting from curiosity to something much closer to dread. The shadows were not distortions at all, they had structure, alignment, and contours that suggested intention. What emerged first were outlines, elongated, unnatural, as if something had stretched beyond its natural proportions just to be caught at the edge of the frame. The shapes curved forward, angling toward the couple in a posture that felt predatory, almost tender in a sickening way, like figures leaning over sleepers unaware of being watched. The more the image clarified, the more impossible it became to interpret the shapes as inanimate. They had shoulders, sloping unevenly, and limbs that didn't quite match human anatomy, bent in ways no joint should bend. Their faces remained obscured, yet there was an impression of eyes, too many or perhaps simply too deep, staring directly into the lens as though aware they were being observed across time. One technician whispered that the figures seemed closer than the couple, closer to the camera, and this observation sent a chill through the group. If the shapes were indeed leaning forward, they would have been occupying the same position as the photographer. The idea that something else might have stood between the lens and its human subjects nearly 2 centuries ago made the air feel tighter, as if the room itself were shrinking. Dr. Quinn decided to enhance the lighting and contrast further, hoping it would debunk the unsettling interpretation, yet the higher the clarity climbed, the more unmistakable the forms became. They were not behind the couple but directly overshadowing them, looming with an awareness that felt intelligent and malicious. The couple's expressions, once merely stiff, now took on a new context under this revelation. Their eyes, slightly off-center, appeared strained, as if they were listening for something or trying desperately not to look at what they sensed just above their shoulders. The man's right hand, previously overlooked, trembled ever so slightly in the sharpened image, as though captured mid-flinch. The photograph no longer looked like a posed portrait from 1847 but a moment interrupted, a snapshot of 2 people who knew they were not alone. When the final enhanced version of the daguerreotype rendered on the monitor, the atmosphere in the lab shifted from tense curiosity to something far more visceral. The room felt colder, the hum of the machine sharper, as though the photograph itself had altered the air around them. The team stood in a semicircle around the screen, each person waiting for someone else to say what they were all thinking but could not quite articulate. Dr. Quinn took a slow breath and instructed the system to toggle between the original scan and the newly enhanced one, hoping that flicking between images would reassure them, revealing the same static details each time. But instead, the comparison made their unease multiply. Certain elements within the image did not appear consistent, details that should have been fixed in place were subtly different, as if the photograph had shifted between scans. The most unsettling inconsistency involved the couple themselves. In the original unenhanced scan, their expressions were vacant and expressionless, typical of early photography. But in the enhanced version, something about their eyes had changed. They were wider, more strained, the gaze sharper, no longer drifting slightly away from the lens but seemingly focused on something just outside the frame. Their mouths appeared tighter, almost trembling with held breath. The difference was slight enough that it could have been dismissed as the result of improved contrast, yet the emotional shift behind their expressions felt too deliberate, too aware. One technician muttered that it looked as if they had been startled between captures, as though the enhancement process had revealed a moment that had not existed before. More disturbing still were the shadowy figures. In the earlier images, they appeared as looming beings behind the couple, indistinct but positioned in a way that suggested they were leaning over them. Now, in the enhanced frame, the figures seemed closer. Their edges sharper. Their position slightly altered, as though they had shifted forward or angled their heads differently, responding to being noticed. The idea that these forms had moved within a photograph, a piece of metal sealed for nearly 2 centuries, seemed impossible, yet no one could deny what their eyes were telling them. One of the shapes, previously blurred near the upper left, now had a clearer outline, displaying a contorted arm-like appendage stretching downward, almost brushing the woman's shoulder. A sudden flicker of the overhead lights drew gasps, and for a moment the entire lab plunged into dimness before stabilizing. When the screen brightened again, several members insisted the figures looked even closer than before, as if the brief blackout had allowed them to advance unnoticed. Dr. Quinn forced herself to maintain composure, but even she could not shake the feeling that the photograph was no longer a frozen moment from 1847, but an interaction, a living exchange between the captured shadows and those who dared to look too closely. As the team continued comparing the images, the sense of dread that had been quietly building finally solidified into something unavoidable. Dr. Quinn attempted to reassure everyone, insisting that variations in restored photographs were common, especially with daguerreotypes, but even she struggled to convince herself. The changes were too precise, too purposeful. When she enlarged the region near the woman's shoulder, where the shadowy appendage had seemed to reach, the entire room leaned closer with her. The limb-like blur had taken on a disturbingly clear texture, something between stretched skin and thin, sinewy muscle, impossibly detailed for a photographic plate from 1847. It no longer appeared as an artifact of aging metal, it looked like something captured mid-motion. The more they enhanced the image, the more unnerving details surfaced. The man's posture, previously rigid and formal, now showed a subtle lean, as if he had shifted his weight or recoiled slightly from whatever was behind him. The woman's hands, originally resting calmly in her lap, now seemed clenched, her knuckles faintly defined in a way they hadn't been minutes earlier. The technicians exchanged silent looks, each one processing the growing possibility that they were witnessing changes not caused by technology, but by the image itself responding to their scrutiny. And then one of them noticed something none of them had checked before, the digital timestamp on the enhanced files. Each time the system auto-saved a frame, the metadata listed a new change, even when no one had altered the settings. The timestamps were seconds apart, yet each saved version showed minute but undeniable differences in the figures' positions. It was as though the photograph was updating itself every time the computer attempted to store it. Dr. Quinn pulled up a sequence of the autosave side by side, and the progression told a chilling story. The shadowy figures were moving. Not in dramatic leaps, but creeping forward frame by frame, like a stop-motion animation of something advancing with deliberate intent. Their shapes gained clarity, their edges hardened, and the sense that they were leaning closer to the couple, and closer to the viewer, was unmistakable. A technician finally asked the question everyone was avoiding, "Are we causing this?" The room fell silent. It was unclear whether the enhancements were revealing latent details or if the act of observing was allowing the shadows to manifest further. The boundary between recorded moment and active presence felt dissolving, and the couple in the photo seemed increasingly aware of their watchers, their eyes sharpening with a desperation that did not belong to the 19th century. The shadows, meanwhile, appeared less like background entities and more like participants, interacting with the fear growing in the room, feeding on it, drawing closer with every passing scan, as though eager to step beyond the frame. As the photograph continued shifting on its own, Dr. Quinn realized they were no longer dealing with a historical artifact, they were dealing with something alive in a way no one could understand. The final moment came when the lab lights flickered again, this time not returning. The room fell into a cold, unnatural darkness. Only the glow of the computer screen remained, illuminating the terrified faces of the team. On the screen, the couple in the daguerreotype were no longer sitting. They were standing, pressed against the edge of the frame, as if trying to escape. Behind them, the shadow figures had fully taken shape, towering, faceless forms with elongated limbs stretching outward. But now they were not looking at the couple. They were staring directly at the camera, at the restoration team, acknowledging their watchers after nearly 2 centuries of waiting. The image flickered once more, then stretched, tearing slightly at the edges, as though something inside was pushing against the boundaries of the screen. A thin, distorted whisper filled the room, not coming from speakers, not coming from any machine, just vibrating through the air itself. Then the screen went black. When the lights finally returned, the lab was silent. 5 chairs stood empty. There was no sign of Dr. Quinn or her team. Only the daguerreotype remained on the table, the silver surface now strangely warm, almost pulsing. And on the computer monitor, although no one had touched it, a new file had appeared. Restoration_complete.jpg. When investigators opened the file, they froze. It was a perfectly clear image. The couple was gone. The shadow figures were gone. But standing in their place, perfectly centered, were Dr. Quinn and her entire team, staring into the camera with wide, terrified eyes. And behind them, in the deepened darkness, shapes were forming again. The case was closed, the lab sealed, and the daguerreotype locked away, but rumors say the file still changes every few days. New faces appear. Old ones disappear. And each time someone attempts to delete it, another version automatically saves under a different name. As if the photograph is still searching for the next viewer to pull inside.